Monroe wanted to sort of leapfrog all of that, and there was this falling out for a while, although Monroe became a critical part of the Madison administration. And Monroe was all too willing to accept the hierarchical principle when his turn came around in 1816. But interestingly enough, the caucus, the congressional caucus, there were not political conventions in those days. What happened was you had a one-party state. They were the Democratic Republicans, and there were factions within that, and the caucus met. In effect, the members of that party who were serving in Congress would meet as a kind of national political convention. And there was actually a contest in 1816, and it spelled the end of the caucus, and it gave rise to political conventions later on. So Monroe was virtually unopposed. The old Federalist Party was on its death throes, they nominated a man named Rufus King, who was a New Yorker, distinguished, Revolutionary-era statesman like Monroe, but he won something like 47 electoral votes, won a few states in the North, but overwhelmingly Monroe was elected. And then, of course, 4 years later, virtually unanimous. The Madison presidency, aside from the War of 1812, is what is it notable for? The institutionalization, really, of Jefferson's approach. Madison was, in many ways, faithful to his strict constructionist policies. For example, he vetoed, there was beginning to be a large number of Americans, particularly in the West, who wanted the federal government to fund internal improvements. They wanted the federal government to build roads, to build canals, to create the infrastructure for the economy to grow. And Madison opposed that, consistent again with this view. His view was you needed to amend the Constitution to specify that the federal government, now he got around it, interestingly enough, even then, he got around it, as did Monroe. They decided that there was a distinction between improvements in a state and improvements that were interstate. So he actually split hairs and came to accept, again, sort of the pragmatist and the nationalist. He came to accept that a road that crossed state lines was something that could be funded with federal support. But something that was limited to a state, well, it was up to the state and not to the federal government. Madison, by the way, had a very tough re-election in 1812. Had one or two states switched, he actually would have been defeated. But he went out of office very popular because the war was over. There was a perception that we'd won. The Battle of New Orleans cast this patriotic glow. And there was a kind of nostalgia. I mean, there was a sense that the revolutionary generation, of whom Madison, and Jefferson were the personification, were not going to be with us forever. And think of what they gave us, and are we worthy of them? One more. Yeah.
For those of us who have forgotten American History 101, and maybe where our hearing isn't so good, you may have touched upon it, could you quickly review the election process for presidents in those early years, and when did the Electoral College get introduced?
Well, the Electoral College existed from the beginning. What didn't exist at the beginning was any real participation by what you and I would call the electorate, by voters. Electors, by and large, were selected by state legislatures, just as United States senators were. Now, that began to change by the time that we're talking about. Madison, certainly, even Jefferson, several states, particularly the North, actually had popular suffrage. So that you had a fairly significant number of white males. In some cases, there were actually property qualifications attached. But there was an expansion during this period of the franchise. And by the 1820s, when Monroe is ready to turn the baton over to Jackson or John Quincy Adams, by then most states, in fact, there are only one or two states, South Carolina was one, that in fact most states entrusted the selection of electors to the general electorate. So it wasn't democratic in the sense that you and I would use that term, since women couldn't vote and obviously slaves weren't voting, but it was a process that was becoming steadily more inclusive, steadily more representative as the 18 teens and 20s went on. You bet. Thank you very much.
Real quickly, I have a couple of announcements for you. One very, very important announcement. Tomorrow's talk at 11 a.m., the room has changed. It's not going to be here. It's not going to be in the Regency room next door. It's going to be over in the Eberhard Center, the building next door. And we've had such a good waiting list that we want to improve the venue. And you can park at the Fulton lot just underneath 131, just across the street from the Eberhard Center, tomorrow for the 11 a.m. talk, The Odd Couple, Hoover, and Truman. So we hope you'll be able to come. And if you've been on that waiting list, that now opens up for you. So make sure you see Mandy Bird. Mandy, would you please stand up? And is there anything you want to...
64 seats available, and everyone that's already been on the waiting list has already been added, so there's 64 seats available.
Okay, very good. 64 seats available yet for that lecture. The second announcement is just remember that Richard will be back this afternoon at 2 o'clock to give a talk. That's the one that I tricked him with earlier. Calvin, we hardly knew ye. And third, the book signing can begin. It's at the back outside the auditorium. Thank you very much for coming this morning.